Today I'm here with Daniel of Platypus and Warren Mosler, one of the chief architects of the modern monetary theory, to talk about economics and whether or not there's any compatibility or contradictions between the two theories. Warren, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, okay. My name's Warren Mosler, and I live in St. Croix now in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I've grew up in the financial markets, but I've uh, turned over my business to my partners at the end of 1998, my money management. After running it for 16 years, I had a fixed income, zero duration, market neutral fund. I think I invented the space actually back then. Had about 3.5 billion in capital at the end of 19, I said 98, the end of 1997 when I turned it over to my partners. Which was a fair amount of money back then. Back when that was a lot of money, as I said. And since then, I moved here in 2003, and I've been devoting most of my uh, time to my correspondence to modern monetary theory, keeping up with events in the capital markets, and keeping a running discussion going on Twitter, which is now X, and going to various conferences and organized events and over the last 25 years or so. So I guess I'm in semi-retirement, you might say, down here. Along the way, I had a car company. I came up with a concept for a car where I used advanced composite monocoque construction to build a car that was substantially lighter than any other car. So it outran every other car by a wide margin and got 30 miles a gallon back when that was unheard of. And I thought that'd be enough for people to want to buy it, but it wasn't. So I've been out of the car uh, business since 2013, just due to lack of sales. But the cars were very successful and won races and didn't burn a lot of fuel doing it for a very long time. I got involved when I moved down here to St. Croix in boats. I noticed people get seasick a lot going out on boats. Went out and worked out what I thought was why and what could be done about it, and built a ferry that has four hulls instead of two, with a big space in between. So I call it my long wheelbase boat, and people don't get seasick. It doesn't mean somebody won't throw up if they eat a meal and go up and down in the waves, but they don't get that seasickness, which is violent illness. And so that's been I've enjoyed doing that, and it's been very successful. It's been out there for the last 8 or 10 years, and I built a couple of smaller ones for myself to use personally. My time currently is we have a small yacht club here, they call it. Uh, it's a $900 a year membership, so it's not particularly high end or anything. But I've been named the Commodore, so I looking at it as a stepping stone to Secretary of the Navy, and I been spending my time doing that. Also, I the tennis courts near me were closed for COVID. They didn't want to reopen them, so they let me run them. So I'm the manager of the local tennis court.
Nice.
So most of my day is either at the tennis courts or at the yacht club, and then a little bit of correspondence on modern monetary theory in between.
I mean, I don't know how to follow that. I have a much less interesting life, of course. Like I actually just had a question of your design for a boat, can that get as large as like a cruise ship?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, because
Yeah.
I,
Conceptually, yeah.
because I remember seeing people on cruise ships walk around with the thing kind of near their ear, I
Right,
guess.
right.
Yeah.
You're right. They would not need it if they just changed their whole design to what I have.
Okay, which would get over the
Yeah.
thing. My life is
Yeah.
way less interesting. I'm a member of Platypus. I've been a member of Platypus Affiliated Society for about 12 years, but I've probably been around them for about 15 years. Um, I don't know if now is a good time to also say my autobiographical relation to Warren, which is that probably before I read Marx or Smith or Ricardo, I read Warren Mosler as an
Oh,
undergrad.
how about that? How about
Yeah,
that?
the
Where was
seven.
that? Where was that?
I studied at Temple University, so I studied math
Eh,
and economics there. Yeah,
Okay, was that something the whole class
that
studied?
was that was me. That was
Just you.
kind
Okay.
of me going down. And I guess the
Yeah.
reason I bring that up is that my first encounter with MMT, was in the wake of things like not just the 2008 crash, but also the Tea Party protests.
Yes,
And so
yes.
I was visiting a variety of blogs. There was one written anonymously called Social Democracy in the 21st Century. The guy writes
Mhm.
under the pseudonym Lord Keynes, but we kind of don't know who he is.
Yeah.
And
I've seen,
you've seen it. And so I
I've seen
encountered
the
your seven deadly innocent frauds.
frauds.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. And I think I read it about the same time that I read Keynes's general theory, but this was on my own. This was just my own
Yeah.
curiosity of being I don't know, rambunctious young person wanting to
All right.
argue with these Tea Party people
Yeah.
and, certainly looking for the ammunition. So I thought that would be an interesting way of kind of setting
Did you
things up.
see my addresses to the Tea Party online?
I have,
There's a couple of
I
YouTube,
probably have, yeah.
there are a couple of YouTubes. They liked everything I said. Which is interesting. It's very, very nonpartisan. Where Jamie Galbraith, I don't know if you know the name. One week he's got me in Paris talking to his like people who are left of Marx somewhere, and then the next week I'm at the Dallas Tea Party telling the exact
Yeah.
same story, and both sides thought this is the way to go. So I always felt good about that.
Yes. I'm wondering if I don't know if I've met Jamie Galbraith in person. I have met somebody who you would also be familiar with from another side of things in person, Peter Schiff. So again, this
Yes,
was
yes,
kind of in the this is my young college days of being like,
yeah,
okay, these people and going and seeing them and asking them questions and
yeah.
Okay,
I've
thanks.
become pretty good friends with Peter's portfolio managers who came to me and said, "Don't say anything, but if it wasn't for you, we'd have gone out of business a long
oh
time
no.
ago."
Yeah.
So,
Because they still invested in normal stocks. They didn't do
yeah,
all
yeah,
gold,
yeah,
did they? Yeah, of course. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, they're very good, by the way.
Oh yeah.
They know,
Is it
they
his
know,
brother? Did his
no,
brother?
no, no,
Okay.
no. These are some portfolio managers that he hired.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
They know exactly how things work, and they do very well.
To get into the discussion, I'm just going to set the table here a bit with some of my
Yeah,
overall thoughts on the two perspectives, both of which I greatly value. One of the things I think we're going to talk about might be value itself. So today is the third MMT discussion I've hosted on this channel. I might keep doing so as long as there appears to be some contradiction to unpack or to resolve between these perspectives. My perspective is that while I think MMT is more or less accurate, as far as I can tell, in it describes the capacities and constraints of modern currency sovereign economies, its prescriptions may not be ultimately able to resolve the problems of the falling rate of profit and the breakdown tendency of capitalism. And that if capitalism is interminably abolishing its own source of surplus value, human labor, through automation and competition, all of the public spending in the world can't really ultimately prevent that breakdown. Or can it? Maybe Mosler will be able to answer that. You still run into the problem of decreasing rates of profit and the overaccumulation of capital going unvalorized, even with an MMT conscious state or society. Does an understanding of MMT make capitalist equilibrium possible? That's another question you and Bill allude to in your newest book. MMT, from my thinking, is kind of like a theory of a modern Bonapartism, which is a Marxist term, which is really to say that it's a theory of how the state sitting atop of society could or should mitigate capitalism's undesirable externalities like inflation and unemployment and its cyclical crises in the post-Bretton Woods world. This might also be seen as a way to dampen the class struggle as well. On the other hand, I've read Marx's Capital like 4 or 5 times, and I don't see any major problems with the labor theory of value either. But Marx's barter theory account of the history of money doesn't appear correct. Either way, we no longer live in a fixed exchange gold standard system. And while prices seem to continue to obey the labor theory of value, the character of money itself has changed such that the currency issuer is no longer constrained like it was in Marx's time. So, do these two theories complement or contradict each other? Is either theory flawed or incomplete? I asked ChatGPT, actually. Here's what it said. Even under a fiat system, value production, as explained by labor theory of value, can still occur. Commodities continue to be produced through labor, and profits continue to be extracted from surplus value. Money under fiat systems acts as a token of value rather than a commodity itself. It facilitates the distribution of the value created by labor, but no longer represents value in the same direct way it did under gold-backed systems. And finally, from this perspective, MMT can be seen as describing the circulation of money and how its supply impacts demand and employment, while the labor theory of value describes how value is generated in the first place. So it seems to think these two ideas are complementary. Anyway, you can pick up or leave anything I just said.
Okay. Now, have you seen my general theory of value? It's
I
relatively
have.
new, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but
Okay.
you should probably say it to the, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to work all these in. You have so much to what they call unpack here.
Take your time. How about I'll ask the question then. Now I
Yeah,
have to moderate. Just kidding. Like talk
yeah,
about value because I've read the article, the general theory of value that you have. So maybe you can say
yeah.
what you have two views of value actually right at the front.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, importantly, value isn't defined when somebody says a general theory of value, so you have to define it because it could be anything. Whether oranges are good value relative to grapes or something. It's not about that. So what I've said is, I'm looking at it in terms of the monetary system, and you have the value of having a monetary system, and then you have value within the monetary system, which are two different things entirely. So, does it do us any good to have a monetary system? What does it accomplish? Should we have a monetary system? What is the value of having a monetary system? What are the costs and benefits of a monetary system? So that's one. So when you talk about a general theory of value, that's the starting point. Now, if you decide there is value to a monetary system because countries that have monetary systems win the wars, and if you're not going to win the war, it's all moot anyway. So let's say there is value to a monetary system because you want to have a chance at winning the war, or um, for whatever reason, you decide there's value in a monetary system, then we can get down to okay, what is value within that monetary system? Where does it come from? What is it? How does it work? And of course, so that's what that paper was about. Now that blends into what I've been talking about with MMT from the beginning. That the, in the first instance, the monetary system is there to provision the government. Okay, we have a government, we have a population, and we want collective action. So how do we make that happen? How do we get a military? How do we get a education? Public education? How do we get a public health department? How do we get a legal system? How do we provision collective action? And the way we are doing it now, and we can argue whether it's right or wrong or whatever, but the way we're doing it is through tax-driven currency, what the Romans used to call tribute money. Okay, so they conquered Gaul and they taxed them in Roman coin, and the only way they could earn these Roman coin to avoid getting burned down again by the Roman army was to sell grain to Rome, who would pay for them with their, whatever the coin was called. And they called that tribute money. And they understood exactly what they were doing. When you conquer somebody, we want them to send us real things. Here's how we're going to get that done. So the Roman government used the monetary system to provision itself with soldiers, with food from conquered enemies, with everything else. And the way it did it was, in the first instance, the first thing that drives the whole thing is the tax liability, the tax requirement. And so the whole story, the whole money story begins with a tax requirement. You don't have a modern money story, modern monetary story. You don't have a fiat currency story. Um, you have a barter story of some type. If you're using gold, it's a barter story. If you're using warehouse receipts, it's a barter story. But when you're using tax credits, that's the floating exchange rate, modern monetary story. I don't like to use the word sovereign government because it's anyone who has taxing authority can do this. If it happens to be a government that has the mandate from the people that we makes it sovereign, that has the taxing authority, that's fine. And it's generally associated, but that's kind of a special case, not a general case. Okay, so every tax requirement specifies the tax credit, the thing that can be used. If it's something that's the beach, you're not going to get anywhere. You put a tax requirement of grains of sand on a beach, you're going to get a treasury filled up with beach sand, and that's about it, or desert sand. Not going to be anything else. The way it's done on practical is tax credit, something only the government said, and so for the US, it could be in Japan, it's the Japanese yen. So the tax requirements name tax dollars as US dollars as the thing you need to be able to pay your taxes. So number one, a tax is levied. There's a tax liability put in place payable in US dollars. The US dollar is designated as a tax credit. Once that's in place, now the system's in operation. Now things start to happen. And it has to be enforceable. People just laugh at you, dollars, so what? Oh, well, you're going to get your house taken away. You're going to lose, you're going to go, something bad's going to happen if you don't pay your taxes. So it's a coercive system from the start. So we have a system of uh, collective action that's coercive. Now, it may be established through a democratic process or representative process, but the collectively it's agreed that this is coercive. We've agreed to subject ourselves to a coercive system to provision our government, and so now that there's a tax requirement with penalties, you now have people looking for paid work to earn what they need to pay the tax, looking to sell goods and services to get the money to pay the tax, the dollars, the tax credits to pay the tax. Okay. What do we call people looking for paid work? We call them unemployed. That's our definition. Now, you could come up with another definition, and that's fine. But right now, the working definition, when somebody says, what's the rate of unemployment, we're looking at people looking for paid work. When Marx was talking about unemployment, it was hordes of people, mass unemployment, looking for paid work. They weren't looking to volunteer for the American Cancer Society. They wanted money because things were for sale with money, right? Because it was needed to pay the tax. So tax liabilities by design create unemployment for the further purpose of the government then hiring those unemployed to provision the government, to hire soldiers, to hire legal system judges and lawyers, and to hire to buy food for whatever they want from the farmers. But so that's the dynamics that's behind the currency. It's all about public provisioning the collective action as determined by the people, as determined by the dictator. But somebody who's got the taxing authority is trying to get collection and collective action going. And that's where it starts. It doesn't start. Marx's story about class and struggles, that's fine. And maybe out of that struggle came a class that decided to use a coercive monetary system for its own ends, or to win a war, or to do something. And originally it was, and what it was historically almost doesn't matter anymore. It's what it is today. Who's got the taxing authority today? What are they doing with it? How is it controlled? But you go back to thousands of years, it was the temples who had the taxing authority. You had to tithe 10% of your grain or something like that. And they had the authority to do that. There were penalties. You wouldn't go to heaven, or you'd be cast out from the tribe and die in the wilderness. I don't know what they would do to you if you didn't pay. And they could then use tokens that represented bushels of grain that they could then go spend in the marketplace, that people could use to pay their taxes if they didn't have the actual grain. And that was the same monetary system that we have today, fundamentally. Okay, there's a tax liability. What do you need to pay the tax? You need grain, or you need tokens that represent this grain. And only the temple can issue these grain tokens, for example. The story of tally sticks in England. They used them for, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of years. You have to pay your taxes. You have to turn in this piece of wood that they had broken off of another stick. And they knew you were turning in the correct stick. They could take a stick called a tally stick, had a stock and a stub, and that's where things like the stock market came from. And they'd break off a piece of wood, and they could spend that. The government could, to provision itself in the marketplace, because people needed that to pay taxes, fines, and fees back to the king or whoever it was. And they'd have these fairs, all those medieval fairs, where they had a big table, which was where the chancellor or the exchequer would be there, and people would come with their sticks, and they'd come with their stubs or whatever, and they'd piece them together and then tell them, okay, you're paid, and give them a release. And that's what those medieval fairs were apparently originally all about, was reconciling all these broken sticks. And it was used until maybe 1820 or something, and they were kept in Parliament, caught fire, and nearly burned the city down. And then they stopped using them. So it's lots of good history on this stuff. But again, that's the government trying to provision itself. It doesn't have anything to say about social relations. Now, what I can say is that when you have taxation like that, that's not just this year, but it's ongoing. And it's like having a pair of pants with pockets with holes in them. You got to keep filling them up because they keep leaking out. Okay, this is the thing about taxation. It induces like enormous anxiety into the population. When you talk about people having greed and that it's something wrong with them, I think it stems from coercive taxation that's ongoing and forever. You can never have enough because it's always running out. And no matter how big your pile is, it's never enough because in your mind, it's running out. And somebody said, "I'd rather be, you know, you know, 1,000 miles away from heck and going away from it than 10,000 miles away and going towards it." Right.
Hmm.
So, you're always like going towards it. You've
Mhm.
always got to fight this thing, and it's 24/7, and it just poisons the mind and causes people to dedicate their lives to trying to overcome this insecurity and anxiety introduced by the monetary system. But it's powerful, and they will do everything for money. They will sacrifice their lives for money. They'll sacrifice their mothers for money.
Mhm.
Okay, and that provisions the government ultimately, and that gives them what they need to go out and win the war. And that's the country that survives when the other one gets defeated.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a Darwinian thing where it's a race to the bottom. So if you're going to ban the monetary system because of taxation, because of what it does psychologically to human beings, you've got to do it to everybody in the world. Because if you leave out anyone, they're going to conquer the rest. so,
Could it,
so yeah,
Can I just add off the
yeah,
taxation question? Because I just
yeah,
saw a local left group
yeah,
is protesting. It's like, oh, we're out to protest the tax cuts for the rich. But
yeah,
actually, if I'm kind of following your view, it's like, well, it's not really, there's kind of no point in protesting the tax cuts for the rich unless you thought we were right on
yeah.
the edge of inflation and somehow they're going to push us over that. But to me, I'm like, what does that have to do with anything? That still has
But
that, yeah,
yeah, well, I could see a point. I don't know if it's their point, which is
right.
that you have once you have a certain amount of money, then you or then use it for influence. And so you could argue that if Elon Musk had been able to make that kind of money, he wouldn't be able to do what he's doing. And so you want to keep people from the kind of money that allows them to influence politics, for example. So that would be a reason to tax the rich. That has nothing to do with inflation or anything, but it's something to do for like social. Now, for me, I've got a couple of problems with that. Uh, Number one, it's like one of those things that sounds good in theory, but in practice, every attempt I've seen in my 50 years has not taken away the influence of a
Of
small
course.
group of people with a lot of money. It just doesn't work at a practical level.
Right.
So they managed to find a way around it. Doesn't mean you could close all those loopholes. Yeah, in theory you can, but in practice nobody does. Somebody gets paid off, somebody gets bribed, somebody goes offshore, something happens. Who knows? But seems like it just doesn't work. But what does work is to take away that money at source. So instead of giving them the money and then trying to claw it back, don't give it to them to begin with. Now that does work, but I've been saying that for a long time and giving examples and what else, and it never even enters into the discussion.
Just to add in what I think you're saying,
Yeah,
because are you
yeah,
talking about, for example, the government giving treasuries to say, well, it's usually going to be people
yeah.
with
Let's say
money?
pay.
Yeah.
Let's say paying interest on treasuries.
Yeah.
We're paying interest on the public debt. Okay, we're paying out $1.2 trillion a year now. It only goes to people who have money, already have money. Nobody else gets interest, and it's in proportion to how much you already have.
Right.
Right? Nothing could be more obscenely regressive, and nothing is. There's no pushback on that at all. I'm like the only one, I think, who talks about that. Now, recently, I got 30 something thousand followers on Twitter, so there's been a few people picked up on it, but not many. And certainly, that's not the argument for low rates from the Fed or anybody of any consequence. And there's nobody in Congress saying, "What the heck are we doing here, paying out twice what we paid in stimulus checks, but only to people who already have money to
Right.
fight inflation?" How much sense does this make? It's not even discussed.
I
So
feel guilty
yeah,
because
yeah,
I've
yeah,
benefited from the 1 to 3 month in the last year, just kind of
yeah,
compounding it when it was like 5%. So yeah,
sure.
so this is Warren and I's first disagreement is that I actually kind of enjoyed it over the last year, but otherwise I agree.
Yeah,
You're right. Yeah.
yeah. But I'm not saying, there's winners and losers.
Right.
Okay. And, you were one of the winners. That's fine. People like to win. I agree with that. But you can't say it's a progressive policy.
Right. Oh
You can't,
yeah.
you can't even, you can't even say it's neutral. You can't even say it's mildly regressive. This is obscenely regressive. This is the biggest expense in the budget. And it's cash, stimulus checks going only to people with money. Like, who would have imagine trying to get a bill in Congress to do that? And yet it's happened in reality. Okay. Um, so I forgot what question we're
So
answering here. You got me.
I mean I was
It's
just
pretty
trying to
easy to
get
set me off on this.
yeah, yeah, no, I was trying to just kind of because in other words,
Yeah.
one of the ways in which MMT seems to approach taxes is that rather than
Oh,
thinking about it,
taxes. Yeah. Yeah.
taxes.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
So let's
yeah.
go back to, I've talked about pretty much eliminating the financial sector in various ways. Number one is zero rate policy. Number two, not selling any treasury debt. Number three, the stock market just having a price at which the companies will sell unlimited shares of stock. So it eliminates all the trading in the stock market, but leaves the investment function. And once you've eliminated all the those aspects of the financial sector, then you've got millions and millions of people who are out of work and will be redeployed into something of real value and will add to our real wealth, okay, enormously. And you've eliminated a big source of this income distribution problem when I've done that. You probably eliminated 50 or 60% of that issue. And again, it gets no traction at all, no discussion, nothing. But it's about taking the funds away at source. If you take away the bonds, the bond traders have nothing to do anymore. They have to do something else. It's that type of thing. If you eliminate income tax, the 10 or 15% of the population tied up in income tax compliance has to go do something else. You've taken away the thing that's causing the source of this wealth. Okay, and then you go to what I've called a property tax, which has no compliance costs. You're not like doing anything to the income. You're not exacerbating the income distribution. So something like eliminating the financial sector, going to a property tax from an income tax, these things eliminate, vast sources of disproportionate income that are
Can I
causing the
ask a
problem.
question
Yeah,
about that?
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
my understanding is it's not literally eliminating the financial sector because you still
Well,
have secure
95% of it. Yeah,
right. So that it's like overhead and also it would shrink. And I'm also a fan of this,
yeah,
like the SEC. In other words, do they have to sit
yeah.
around regulating things all day?
Right.
Maybe the IRS. I mean, do we have to have all
Yeah.
these complicated
No,
taxes?
they'd be gone also, and
Yeah.
all the legal that goes with it. How many lawyers are making tens of millions of dollars, on tax
This is what
compliance, record
exploded
keeping?
after Dodd-Frank. Like if you're going
Right.
to have Dodd-Frank, you're
Now,
going to have all these lawyers who have to do, yeah.
right now, how much of that is contributing to the income distribution issue? Like a
Hmm.
lot of it. That's the source of all this stuff. So you want to cut it off at source. You don't want to have an institutional structure that requires lawyers to make tens of billions of dollars a year and then try and figure out how to tax it away. You change the structure so they don't make the money to begin with. That's how you have to do it. And nothing wrong with trying to tax it away. I'm not criticizing anybody on a moral level for that, but on a practical level, I don't think it's going to happen.
I mean, on a practical level, it also promotes bureaucracy because as soon as you have all this
Yeah, yeah,
taxation
yeah,
aspect, then, the
yeah,
IRS can start to act like a racket.
yeah, yeah. I know
Yeah.
they've done.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've got hard evidence of extortion from the IRS. When I had my company, it's just shameless extortion,
Oh, yeah.
and the regulators. Okay, and when I had a small bank, I owned a bank. They just said flat out, "Yeah, you're allowed to do that, but we're not going to let you. And if you do, we're going to do this." And it's like, okay,
What is the,
this,
sorry, my headphone keeps
yeah,
dropping out. What is the statistic about when the IRS audits, it tends to audit people who are lower income distribution anyways, as it
I don't
is?
know.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know.
Because they can't fight back. They don't have the resources to
Yeah.
fight back.
Yeah.
Well, they told us. they did an audit when I had my securities firm 30 or 40 years ago. There was no action. They found nothing wrong. They investigated, but it was going to cost us like $5 million in court if they pursued it, and they wanted us to pay $5 million to settle. And I didn't really want to do it, but my partners did, and so we went and did it. So I think that's just pure extortion.
Yeah.
And because there was nothing, they had like looked for something on non-economic residuals that we weren't doing. But one of the firms we dealt with, like Payne Weber, or somebody had been doing it. We weren't, and they were trying to get information from us as to what they were doing. We had no idea. So they dropped it, but then said, okay, we're going to leave you as part of the lawsuit but we will settle and drop you for $5 million. So that's just pure extortion.
That is,
Somebody in there gets rewarded for bringing in money.
right.
It's like a judge who gets rewarded for sending somebody to prison. You can't have that kind of thing.
Well, this is a lot of how tax collecting emerged originally, right? There was tax
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
farming, right?
yeah,
In other words, they would
yeah,
pass people along and
yeah,
say they would literally bid on the tax
yeah,
contracts, like in Rome, and then
yeah,
kind of go around and go, "Oh, we'll deliver
yeah,
this for you." And
yeah,
also,
yeah,
even in
yeah,
terms of medieval England, kind of jurisprudence spread as people would look for more examples by which they could have
yeah.
legal cases and be the mediator right there.
And
Yeah.
tax collectors were always the lowest on the social totem pole because of that. They were just despised by everybody because of what they did and what they were incentivized to do.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I guess an example that this is in like maybe two books that I know by you, the Soft Currency Economics and the Seven Deadly Innocent Frauds. I always mess up that name. I apologize. Warren,
That's
tell
okay.
us what is the name of the book?
It's called The Seven Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy.
There you go. Please, everybody,
Yeah.
check it out. I highly recommend it right there.
It's free online at moslereconomics.com under mandatory readings. My daughter came up with that.
There you go. And it's mandatory for everyone listening. So everyone listening has to go and read that then. I wanted to
Right.
bring up an example that I know I've both seen you write it and I've also heard you say this, say in debates you've done with Robert Murphy or just in other,
Yeah.
this is now me
Back,
saying I've listened to you for quite some time. I remember
back,
this
back,
debate.
back when I was a kid.
There you go. Yes. As
Yeah.
as a prodigy, Warren Mosler debated Robert Murphy there. It's the game example. It's the
Yeah.
point, the scorekeeper example in that case.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
was wondering if you could talk about that, and then I kind of have some questions about the model right there in terms of budget deficits,
Yeah.
right there.
So,
So yeah,
so the point of those examples was to talk about how government spends. And if you look at your online banking, you can see how government spends. I have $2,000 in my checking account. I see it on the screen. I'm watching it, and my Social Security check, $3,000 hits. What does that mean? Instead of 2,000, it says 5,000. So what did the government do? They just turned the two into a five. That's it. They didn't hammer a gold coin into the computer. They didn't take somebody's cash and bring it into a room and dump it into another place or something. And in fact, the person who changed the number, it's probably just a computer from a two to a five, doesn't even have any communications with the entity that's doing the taxing, which is changing higher numbers into lower numbers, right? If I had 5,000 and I paid a tax for 2,000, all they do is change the five into a three. They don't get anything.
yeah,
There's no pile of cash that jumps out at their end, your computer or anything. And we see this happen everywhere. When you kick a field goal, you see your score go from 7 to 10. Nobody says, well, where'd the football stadium get those 3 points? Okay, they know it's scorekeeping. They don't say, wow, the score is 56 to 53. We better not award any more points. We might run out and won't be able to play tomorrow. There isn't anything like that. But when you don't understand that, those are the kind of things that are driving policy today, fiscal policy, monetary. They're all being driven by that kind of inapplicable nonsense. It's just not applicable to how the system works. The Federal Reserve, Congress has set them up as the scorekeeper for the dollar. They have a spreadsheet, which is just everybody who's run an Excel spreadsheet or anything else. It's just a ledger. And they enter numbers into accounts. And when they enter numbers into account, that's called crediting the account. And that's how the government spends. They have an account for a bank like JP Morgan or Citibank that has an account for you. And when they pay you money, they change the number in JP Morgan's account. They change the number in Citibank's account. The same way the stadium changes the number. The Fed doesn't have any dollars. It doesn't not have any dollars. It spends by changing numbers higher on its own books, and it taxes by changing numbers lower. And anybody who's played cards with a scorekeeper knows how it works. If you have a good hand and you get 100 points, does the scorekeeper have fewer points now? No. And if you have a bad hand and you give him back points, does he have more? No, he doesn't have any points. He just
When
keeps
you
track of your points. Yeah.
So like almost it's like a law of physics. When I pay my taxes, coming up because I've been filing this
Yeah.
week, in other words, it's just going to be destroying money, but it's not like they're gaining money and putting it in the treasury somewhere.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So the word taxes, when you pay, that's called a tax return. Why? Because you're returning those dollars to the government. They came from the government. You're returning them.
Yeah.
So if you go have a $10,000 ticket to the football game and you sell it to the next guy for 20,000, and he goes to the game and gives it to the guy at the gate, walks in. What does the guy at the gate do? He tears it up and throws it away. Like, why does he tear up a $10,000 ticket, $20,000 ticket, and throw it away? What sense does that make? Okay, but everybody understands that. There's
Yeah.
no mystery there. Okay, if you pay your your taxes with actual cash, this is how I start to book out. You're a waiter and you've got paid an old $20 bills, and you go to the IRS and pay with your $20 bills. They'll give you a receipt and thank you for helping to rearm the Israelis or whatever we do with the money. And then as soon as you leave the
But we have
room,
unlimited money, so we don't have to,
yeah, as
there
soon
you
as
go.
but as soon as they'll thank you for helping do that.
Yeah.
But as soon as you leave the room, they send that money off to be shredded. You can buy shredded money in Washington. Okay, well, how do they need your money if they're sending it off to the shredder? There's something else going on with government.
Right.
The state football stadium is not the same as you or I. You and I do not throw tickets in the shredder. They do. Okay, and
Can I run on that analogy?
sure, sure.
And let's actually finish your point, and then I just wanted to follow up on the analogy. Sorry.
Yeah. So look, the government spends, puts a tax liability in place. It pays us with its dollars. It could be used cash if it wanted to. We would then have that cash when we get paid. Well, it puts a tax liability on, which causes us to need those dollars. So now we go to work for the government. We earn dollars that can only come from the government, signed by the Treasury Secretary, in case you're wondering. Okay, we then buy things or whatever. They get used by the waiter to pay taxes. They give them a receipt. Thank you very much. And they throw it away. It's the government's ticket. It sells it first. What does it buy with it? It buys our labor. There's your labor theory of value. Okay, it buys goods and services. After the tickets have been spent, they're used to pay taxes, and they get thrown away, just like tickets to the movie theater or tickets to the football stadium. No mystery here.
So following this analogy, we're going to stay with
Yeah,
football because the Philadelphia
yeah,
Eagles just won, so that's why we're staying with
yeah,
football.
yeah,
Uh, in your analogy, I'm understanding this as it's the analogy for the monetary system. The Treasury can't run out of money. At least it is the point dealer in this case.
yeah.
The
It's
scorekeeper, yeah,
the idea of running out doesn't apply.
doesn't
It's not that
apply.
it can't. It's not applicable. Yeah,
It applies to
yeah.
me, like me.
Sure.
I'm the currency
Yes.
user. I'm not an
Right.
issuer.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I was going
Right.
to say, just for people listening, what Warren was saying is this is the kind of fallacy that is done regularly, that people kind of have a kind of fallacy of composition of assuming that their household is how the government operates. Warren and I were talking about the Tea Party earlier, and of course, that used to be a popular kind of common sense analogy of, oh, I have to balance my budget. Why can't the government as well? This was a kind of common thing. The reason, however, that I bring this up is that I, if I was to ask in the football game something like, do the football players have rights against the scorekeeper? Like rights. You know what I mean? Like rights. It would
Yeah.
probably be a kind of odd question. It would be like, what do you mean to say that the
Yeah.
offensive line have rights against the scorekeeper? The scorekeeper it's God, basically, in the game. It's kind of ignorance
Yeah.
is the terminology. And yet I guess I bring that up because in this beautiful country that you and I are citizens of, I know our northern neighbor is Yemen in this case. Our country was kind of famously founded on the players in the game sort
Yeah.
of pressing their rights against the scorekeeper, actually, and
Yes.
saying, in
Yes.
fact, so I guess I was sort of wondering how you would think of that in terms of
Yeah.
your analogy, because there is an
Yeah.
analogy, but yeah, go ahead.
So the Constitution is the instructions for the government, and it comes from the 13 states, right? So they didn't have a constitution. They had Articles of Confederation, which was a lot like the European Union was originally. And we had the same problems, of course. It didn't work out particularly well. And so we wound up with this constitution, which is instructions from the states on what the central government, the new score, can do. And one of it was they appointed him scorekeeper with the idea that they can, there's a Bill of Rights attached to it,
Hmm.
and that they can change the rules for the scorekeeper through the amendment process. And all powers of the federal government are derived from the states. Now, what's interesting is I live in a US territory. And so while the federal government is owned by the states, the federal government owns the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's a very different relationship, okay, of the direction of causation of the law and the rights. Our rights come from the federal government. The federal government's rights and obligations, or whatever you want to call them, instructions come from the states. And the states get theirs presumably from the people in the states, but not necessarily, right? Those 13 states doesn't say they need to be representative government anywhere, I think. Oh, it says the federal part of it does, but not the state governments. I'm not sure there's any
I, I,
specification on that. It's on a practical level that hasn't come up. Don't tell anybody, by the way. I don't want to cause trouble.
but I guess this is why it's nice to have a dialogue because we
Yeah,
kind of jump back and forth. And no, but you do have the benefit of a good tax situation, if I remember correctly, in terms of Virgin Islands is probably preferable to, I don't know, Massachusetts or something like that.
not really. We pay
Not
the
really.
same.
Oh, yeah.
We have the same forms. We pay the same federal income taxes. Our local
State-wise. Oh,
tax,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So when they changed the federal tax rates and everything, I'm filling out the same federal forms that you would in Massachusetts, paying the taxes. It's just that the VI government gets the money instead of Washington.
I see.
But the tax is identical. Now they have local taxes, which you may not have. If we have a 5% um, a gross receipts tax, which is really worse than a
Oof,
sales tax. But
oof.
we don't have a separate income tax here. You do. But some states like Florida don't have a separate income tax.
Texas. I used to live in Texas, didn't have one. Yeah,
Texas,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So it's different. We have what's called the Organic Act is our instructions from the federal government as to how we can operate
But
for
maybe
tax purposes.
maybe just to return to the point, the reason I was kind of jumping on rights is that in that case, the 13 colonies, right before
Yeah,
the war breaks out, Thomas Jefferson writes, summary of the rights of British America. And, he
yeah,
says, look, the property that we have is alloidal. It's not that was claimed in the Norman conquests. Like, of course, the Normans come over, they conquer. You said tribute earlier, so we'll run with
yeah.
that. That they were saying, look here, peasants, you have to pay us this
Right,
tribute now and then. And that, Jefferson is making a claim that actually was debated at the time, like someone like Samuel Johnson is saying, the taxation is right, but they're saying taxation without representation. They're making some kind of claim.
right, right,
And
right,
I
right.
guess I'm saying that because in that context, there's the scorekeeper and there's the scorekeeper. There's the scorekeeper that it was the example you gave earlier that the Romans are conquering the Gauls, which was a term basically for anybody who wasn't Roman. So it was like Iberians
Yeah,
or anything. And
yeah.
then there are people saying, we're willing to accept taxes, but it has to be on the basis of these rights that do not originate from the state. And so I'm saying that because I'm trying to figure out where the kind of distinction between the state and civil society plays out in the kind of analogy you gave with the sports game,
Right.
right?
Well,
Yeah,
scorekeeping has its role in football, but the scorekeeper doesn't make the rules or anything like that.
right.
Okay, they're made by the sanctioning body, and one of their jobs is scorekeeping to make so that people can come and see the game in an orderly basis or whatever. And so that's what they do. but they've got a whole other system for determining like how many yards for a touchdown or whatever,
Sure.
and how
Yeah.
long you play the game. And that's got nothing to do. That's a separate operation of the sports team,
But
of the
I guess
league.
the reason
The
I
league,
bring the reason I bring that up is that for me,
yeah,
uh, it's of kind of essential importance, the kind of relationship between the state and society, and that
yeah,
relationship has changed enormously over time. Meaning, if I was to go
right,
back
right.
to Sumeria, which is like Michael Hudson, so this is someone I think you're familiar with, at least you've been
So
told this.
I just saw something.
Yeah,
So what we're separating is provisioning the government with ruling the society. They're two different things.
I agree.
Now
Yeah.
they come together in many ways. There's a lot of overlap, but the monetary system, in the first instance, is about provisioning, society, provisioning the government, and then and yet the government also has this authority to make laws, that have
Yeah.
nothing to do with provisioning.
But even then, like if we were to think about, I think you called gold earlier barter, but I was thinking about trade between sovereigns historically. Like people have used gold because they were kind of like, you're in another, in German, there's a distinction between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, community and society, meaning you're a part of another community. You're a Spartan, and I'm like, I don't know, I'm just Athenian. This is
Yeah,
probably not historically right. We're totally different communities. And not only that, between our communities, there are these wandering tribes. Some of them are Jewish tribes, some of them are these other groups as well that kind of go in the interstices. And none of them, that trade kind of doesn't fall under the dominion of any sovereign. And like, in other words, those people don't have a direct obligation, all of those people,
right, right,
to
right, right.
any state. And yet there is trade happening. And not only is there trade happening, there's like mediated trade. This would be the classic story of people saying, oh, we need money because there's like a double coincidence of wants, that we don't simply rely on barter, but people might
Yeah,
go, oh, I'm going to purchase this because I know I can get the arbitrage selling this over here. And that has existed for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, I guess people still do it.
right.
My dad trades baseball cards.
Yeah, yeah,
This is what he does when he's retired. You make
yeah,
boats, he does baseball cards.
yeah, yeah.
You know, so I guess I'm wondering, isn't that certainly a money form, or is money here being kind of narrowed to the kind of fiat explanation?
Well, let's not use the word money,
Okay.
because I tend to not do that except casually. We're going to the restaurant. Did you bring any money? But other than that,
It's
I don't use it other than that casually. So, is there would trade have still happened even without gold? Probably, I
yeah,
think they would have figured something else. So I'm sure it happened,
it did happen
when
without
no,
gold. Yeah,
right, right, yeah.
yeah.
So there's, people figure out ways to trade if they can, if there's some incentive in it for them. So that's, human nature to try and do that. So, so, but when you want to provision a community and you do it through a currency like the US dollar, then that's what you do.
Right.
And so if you talk about, and then if you want to call that tax credit, the US dollar, if that happens to fit in with your casual definition of money, fine. Oh, it's functioning as what I would generally call money. Oh, wait a minute. Now it's not functioning as money. What happened? But people still need it to pay taxes, but they're not buying other things with it. What happened? Oh, it causes cancer, so nobody wants to touch it, or something, right? So you're talking about two different things here. And
Well,
I'm not
that's
sure
where,
that, we don't have to decide whether if people traded baseball cards, is that money or not.
but
That's just like an academic discussion. It's
but I
not,
don't think it's actually an academic discussion because, in other words, there's a question of where is the authority of the state coming from, which we just talked about. In other words, yeah, a lot of authority of the state did just happen through might makes right, but even then, not always the case, meaning they had to kind of
well,
represent.
different states, it's come from different sources. In the
Right.
United States, it came from the 13 colonies, giving that power that they had over to the central government. Other places, it was the king who took over in a war, and he had the army, military control. We've had military takeovers all over the world, where that's where the authority comes from, the taxing authority comes from. So it could come from a variety of places.
I agree in terms of the authority part, but I guess my point is I'm trying to say the authority can change its content. In other
Yeah,
words,
I
there
think.
has been like the Roman authority that you gave at the
Yeah.
beginning, but the
Well, we
famous,
used to
yeah,
say it's only as good as your next trade, right?
that's it,
Yeah.
right. That would be a nice way. But
Yeah.
I guess coming back to it, I'm still trying to say that the authority, like you brought up representative government earlier, for
Yeah.
example. So to quote our friend Adam Smith, I think he's our friend. We're both friends of Adam Smith. You quote him several times in your text. Adam's
Right. I got those quotes from others, by the way. I've never actually sat down and read
no,
Adam Smith.
and you'll enjoy him. He's like a nice reader, and
I
he's like
know.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
fun
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
That
Pins or something. Yeah.
now I feel bad because I was going to quote Adam Smith, and I'm not trying to like
It's okay. It's okay.
yeah.
It's okay.
I was
Pull
going
a
to
rank
say
on me.
that in book four, when he's talking about he's writing right before the American Revolution. He says, "Look, the representative government was unknown in ancient Rome, and it was
Right.
unknown because it was kind of not feasible, meaning ancient kind of communities, political power was a lot stronger in a lot of ways because that's
Hmm.
kind of how people found their freedom, deciding war. It would have been directly even deciding like the coins and the insignia on the coins in a way that
Hmm.
I have. I don't know. I guess we can petition to put somebody on the $100 bill. I guess Trump tried this, whatever, 2 weeks ago or something.
Yeah.
But the reason I bring that up is that the necessity of representative government, as Adam Smith is saying in his famous book Four, and then was behind both kind of the American and French revolutions, is that in practice it's become necessary because kind of the main activity of people is becoming more and more, they would say, commercial or based on monetary exchange in a way that was like not the case in Rome, right? Like really you had
Right.
slaves
Right.
and peasants working on latifundia. You had people who didn't work. To work was like bad, right? It was a
Hmm.
mark that you had been conquered. And you were, other people were working so that other people could go into the polis and make these political decisions. This is the realm of kind of what it means to be human. And so I say that because I'm still like, in that reading, and obviously we can challenge it, but just in that reading, the necessity of breaking with the British government was out of actually having an appropriate political representation of what was going on in civil society. And so I say that because even then, the content of the kind of money that would then be set, I don't know, declared. This is like George Knapp. It's like declared. This is, he calls it like a litric debt or something.
Hmm.
That the content of what it's supposed to capture had changed. And so for me, it's not like just simply two different things. It's actually what is the relationship between the change in society and how then that would be registered in the state. And that's why I kind of went to the analogy of the scorekeeper. And I know maybe you
Yeah.
can say the scorekeeper,
Well,
go ahead. Yeah.
well, the currency is either a tax credit or it's not, right? And so we're explaining systems now where it's a tax credit. Now there could be other systems where it's not a tax credit. That's fine. I understand that. And I don't know enough of history or trust enough of what I read about history to know whether what actually happened anyway,
Yeah.
um, with AI and all that, maybe none of that ever happened. I
But
don't know. So it
yeah,
might just be a chip in my brain that makes me think it happened. But I know what a tax credit is and what isn't. So,
yeah.
and I can tell you how it's going to work with a tax credit, and I can tell you the U.S. dollar works as a tax credit, nothing more. That's just the yen, the pound, and all the other currencies in the world.
Yeah. Can
And
I,
so, yeah, go ahead.
no, a follow-up question. I should have asked this earlier. I was actually curious about how you like thought up MMT, even like how it came to you, even like the kind of thought process. Because in my
Yeah.
understanding, well, go ahead. I don't even want to
Well, it
spoil it. Yeah.
depends on what MMT is. I
Yeah.
can talk I can talk about how I came to get started on this mission, which has now
How
come to
about
be known
that?
as MMT.
Yeah, that would be better. I didn't know
But
how to pose the question,
so
but
Phil
yeah.
Armstrong's writing a book. I have a biographer, so that's why my head point look a little bigger than normal.
Oh, I do know
It's
Phil Armstrong because did you
yeah,
co-author something with him as well?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yep. Okay, so he's
yeah,
writing a biography. That's very
yeah.
interesting.
And he's
But
already got
anyways,
a draft done. He's out for comment. So, so a lot of things have come up, in doing that, talking to people I knew. He interviewed people from the past and all that. So you'd be interested in that. So back in 1977, I was at Bankers Trust, and I was there from 76 to 78. So I'm only guessing it was in 77. And I came from a small savings bank. And Alan Rogers was the trading manager. And he didn't move his mouth when he talked. He talked like this.
That's
So
me usually. Sorry.
yeah, yeah. And he says 2 billion 2-year notes are going to be auctioned. He says, where's all the money going to come from to buy those 2-year notes? Because this was a record high number of 2-year notes. And I remember saying, Alan, it's the same money that the Treasury deficit spends. They spend money, it adds to accounts at the reserve accounts at the Fed, and then those reserve accounts buy Treasury securities. And that's it just goes, it's back where we started from. It's just what we call a round robin trade. You debit the Treasury's account, credit the Fed's account, you debit the Fed's account, you credit the Treasury's account, all at the same time. There's nothing actually changing. It's just a pair off, you know. And he just looks at me like there's something wrong with me. And he asks the same question to the next guy. Where do you think the money's come from? Well, I think pension funds might do it now. They were all worried about whether there was enough money out there to buy this stuff. And I'm saying at the macro level, it's just the spending is the credit. And then when we buy it, it's the debit. And it all happens at the same time. And every morning when we got into work, everybody be poring over the numbers from the Bank of England about how many treasury bonds they bought overnight. And they bought so many 2-year notes and so many 5-year notes and so many 10-year notes. Oh, what if they don't buy our debt? What's going to happen? Okay, and then it was the Japanese and the Chinese. And it's always been somebody. And it's never mattered. And I've always had the same answer. Now, how did I know that? I don't know. I didn't read it somewhere. Nobody told it to me. It's just like how it's not, you could say it's intuitive, but it's not particularly insightful. Like how else can it work, right? But somehow, and that's 1977, so I was 28 years old, so I wasn't a kid anymore. I'd worked for a year there with customers, watching the Fed, watching Treasury balances go up and down, watching accounts go up and down. And I watched it with an eye out to, okay, how does this work? When when they spend, they credit this account, debit that account. Okay, I mean, then if that doesn't tie in, if the accounts don't add up, somebody's made a mistake.
Can I ask a question about
go
this,
ahead.
about your colleagues, which is that your colleagues were very interested in, like, oh, are they buying our debt? Are they buying our debt? I know this is a point that it seems like Stephanie Kelton, your friend, makes, which is that people continue to have at the very least, a Bretton Woods, if not earlier, concept of monetary system where they still kind of like stuck on a kind of, would you say, anachronistic or obsolete way of thinking about it? In other words, they were thinking, are we going to have, go ahead.
It's at least incomplete.
Yeah.
Because they're thinking that, the Treasury has to get funded, which is true. But they're not recognizing that the government as a whole doesn't get funded. The Treasury gets funded from the Fed, which is another agent of government. So the government sets up two agents. One that does the funding, just credits the account, and the other that needs its account credited or it's not allowed to spend by policy. If it wasn't a policy, the Treasury wouldn't need to have its account credited.
Right.
The Fed could just credit JP Morgan's account, account for that by debiting Treasury, and Treasury would have an overdraft. So what? Okay, but they don't. They have a policy that tells them not to do that. Now, whoever put that policy in place is probably somebody who doesn't have any idea what they're doing, only because I've talked to a lot of people who might have been the ones to do that, and they don't have any idea what they're doing. I mean, I know they don't. And I've never met a Treasury Secretary or anybody else who did know what they were doing. If I'd met one, it would have been encouraging, but I've never.
But was it plausible at one time? I mean, I'm thinking of, there's an article by Beardsley Rummel. I think it's from the 40s, right? Where in that he says something similar. He's like he was a Fed governor, I believe. But he says only for domestic policies can the government kind of spend as much as it wants. We still have an international position. So the reason, I guess,
right.
So did it change? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in theory, the international position was convertible into gold.
Right.
But was it actually? Okay. Well, this 1934, they said internationally it's convertible, domestically it's not. Okay. But it was never tested until 1971 when France said, okay, we want the gold. And Nixon said, yeah. No, that was, he said no. And so, well, what if they'd asked 5 years before? Would Johnson have said no? Probably. Would Kennedy have said no? Probably. I don't know. Would anybody have said yes? We don't know.
Right.
So was it ever convertible if it was never tested? Did we act as if it was convertible? No.
Right.
The Federal Reserve was
Oh,
crediting reserve accounts. By the time France asked for there was like 4-to-1 convertible currency to gold. So if the Federal Reserve had, since Bretton Woods started, whenever that was in the 40s,
so
they'd
in a
never
sense, the
they
euro dollar shortage was just a kind of fluke. Like there wasn't
there's
anything.
there's never been a euro dollar
Yeah.
shortage. There's been an interest rate that they might have thought was too high, but there's never been a shortage. It's not
Mhm.
possible. It's just a debit and a credit on a non um, regulated entity such as Citibank London or JP Morgan London.
Yeah.
They have a book in London, a book by meaning a spreadsheet. They just get a computer with a copy of Excel or something on it, or Google. That was before Google Docs, and and they put loans and deposits on that spreadsheet. They weren't insured, but why would they do that? And they called them Eurodollars. If you have a customer, because they didn't have to pay FDIC insurance on it,
Right.
so they could give you a rate that's a little bit higher if you're a saver, a little bit lower if you're a borrower. And so there's an enormous amount of money to be saved by keeping these debits and credits on a separate set of books that was outside of Fed regulation, Fed, taxation, and that's what it was. It had nothing to do with the euro or money leaving the country or anything like that. It was just a separate set of books outside of U.S. taxation. It wasn't outside of any geography.
Well, I guess people
Not,
thought it could be a shortage if they were to convert, but you're saying nobody ever tested that.
well, your dollars were not convertible currency.
But wouldn't it get traced back to the Bretton Woods system? Like this is why.
Well, if Citibank agreed to give you, um, to have those convertible, fine. I don't know that they did though.
No, no,
I
no.
think that,
I know the Soviets were involved in having. This is why I brought it up, just to be a little silly about it, that they were holding basically dollars, even though they were claiming to be on a socialist economy or something.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
Sorry,
they,
keep going. Yeah.
but they were just holding balances in a bank,
Right.
dollar balances in a bank account, Barclays or Citi or JP Morgan or the Federal Reserve Bank or the Bank of England. They just had dollars in a bank account. That's all they had. They're not like nothing ever leaves the country. There's no such thing as capital flight with fixed floating exchange rate.
Right.
That's only when physical reserves move out.
Bullion.
Now, yeah, not, and even then, it just moved from one room at Fort Knox to another. It never even left the country. So
Right.
there's no, if dollars are leaving Mexico or something, all that means is somebody in Mexico who had dollars in an account at Citibank, that account now has a different name on it. It's gone from Jose to Joe. And so dollars left Mexico, but they just stayed at Citibank the whole time.
So going back in the
Yeah,
story,
yeah,
this is the reason why we'll also come back to, I want to hear more about how I really liked enjoying your thought process and coming to that as well. But I wanted to go back to so then before Bretton Woods, when we were on a gold standard. So
yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is, to the degree that we were on a gold standard, then it was plausible that you would care about these things. I think you write about it in, I want to say,
Right.
soft currency economics,
Yeah,
that it's
there's
the
an
myth
appendix
as a
at the
multiplier. Yeah.
yeah. There's an appendix at the back where with a fixed exchange, and that was the whole thing about the Murphy debate with the Austrians.
Right.
What they say is entirely applicable to fixed exchange rate regimes. So they're not wrong, but they're only correct in Hong Kong and Bulgaria or wherever we have fixed exchange rates now. They're not applicable. It's not that they're wrong. They're not applicable for the US or for
Hmm.
Russia or anywhere else. And at times when a central bank intervenes, which is a fixation of the bank rate, then Austrian analysis applies there too. So so that's the distinction. It's not right or wrong. So there's no debate between MMT and Austrian economics in the formal sense. There's a debate between me and maybe an Austrian economist who doesn't recognize that his theory applies to, or his understanding applies to fixed exchange rate. But once you understand what they are, it's all reconciled. There's no problem there at all.
Right. No, I think I had mentioned at the beginning, because as a
Yeah.
young lefty fighter, that I wanted to debate all of these Austrians. I spent a whole
Yeah.
summer reading like Hayek, and I read Human
Yeah.
Action, because I'm going to take on these people.
Yeah.
And I always feel like when I'm listening to them, their view of society is one of like it begins in the 17th century, right? They like talking about Locke a lot, and then kind of also
Yeah.
Richard Kent-Talion and these type of people. And then basically since then, it's been some disaster of just the state intervening or something like that.
Well, and they also say, and others have said that if anybody ever understood, if the population understood how it actually worked, it would collapse, that type of thing. And there's plenty of evidence that's not true either.
Oh, that,
So,
yeah.
they say, they just vote unlimited spending and benefits and we'd have hyperinflation. And so they're really, inflation fear mongers more than anything else because people don't do that. We just lost an election to a fascist who's taken away all our actual rights. You saw what they just did with that law firm. This stuff's nuts, okay?
Perry Coie? I forget. Yeah, the Clinton
Yeah.
one, the Clinton linked one.
No, yeah. Well, it was,
Perkins Coie. I don't know why I was blanking on that. Yeah, isn't that
yeah,
it? Yeah,
I
go
don't
ahead.
know, just yesterday anyway, because they had gotten involved in the January 6th defense or something. And so they pulled all their government contracts from them, even though they've been out of it for 5 years or whatever. So, but anyway, I've just dropped the point I was trying to
Oh,
make.
I guess what I was I was kind of
Yeah,
I didn't want this to be like a Q&A and kind of like a
yeah, yeah,
dialogue or
yeah, yeah,
something like that, a nice fun dialogue, which was
yeah,
that
yeah.
one thing that I feel like they raised an interesting question about is that they seem to be sensitive, again, back to this earlier point about like society. Now
Yeah.
they have their own way of putting it, like they kind of just put the
Oh yeah, no, I
state.
know. I
Yeah.
remember what it was.
Oh yeah, go ahead, go
So
ahead.
that
Yeah.
we'd have hyperinflation if everybody understood monetary operations, and so we just had this regime, which I'm not saying they had any merits, but certainly I can say they're the lesser two evils because the new one has systemic risk that I don't think was there before. But anyway, and why did they lose? Because inflation was 3%, and people would rather have unemployment than 3% inflation. So that kind of puts to rest the idea that if people understand the trade-off, they're going to vote for inflation over unemployment. They're not. They're not going to vote. They're voting for somebody to cut all their own benefits, to cut Social Security, to cut everything else because inflation was 3%.
Hmm.
Okay, so where's this idea come from that if they ever knew how it worked, you know, we get all these benefits and inflation would rip because that's what people would want. They
Don't
don't.
they?
It's the opposite.
I
I think I know why.
Yeah. Good.
It's because if you've got 10% unemployment, you have 90% who are employed. And those people like it because if they need a plumber or they need their lawn cut, they've got qualified people begging to do it, in a bidding war for little bits of money. So they like having that feeling of power over the unemployed. And
Hmm.
so when unemployment gets too low, they get nervous. They don't like it. I called the guy and it's going to take 2 weeks before I can get my air conditioning. They don't like that, even though they're doing well and everybody's doing well, and he didn't, we had a hard discussion. He just told me he wouldn't work. He went somewhere else. People don't like that. They like to have that
Mm.
control. Now that's just my social theory. I don't know how that
No,
fits in
that's
line with
Warren.
Marx, but
You can have all of the. Please have all your. I
yeah.
mean, also, if you have 10% unemployment, you might not have plumbers because you just have unemployed people, meaning you don't have
Well, you
anybody.
still have 90% input.
Yeah. No, of course. I
Yeah.
mean, I like again. I'll even do an autobiographical
Yeah.
thing. One of the reasons I was attracted to MMT when I was a young person is look, I was getting out of college, went to college on a scholarship, multiple scholarships, math, economics. Do you know where I worked? Bed Bath and Beyond. I
Yeah.
worked I could have totally foregone a college education, and then my job out of that as well was,
Yeah.
totally to any college degree. And I would hear people tell me, they would say, oh, the government is spending too much, right? If you remember about,
Right.
go
But look,
ahead.
the coercive taxation is why there's even this defensiveness about going to school for vocational purposes or going for educational purposes, right? What's the big defensiveness? Because it's this ongoing need to pay taxes. And so you feel like I have to explain that type of thing. And what would be wrong with just having a purely educational education,
Sure.
non-vocational education? Would we have a better, would you rather live in a world where people making change at the counter had a full classical education? I would, that would be my preference for a world to live in. uh, and not so, but everybody says, oh yeah, well, how much money are you going to make doing that? Well, that I don't measure that in money, right? I measure that in, how it feels when you go to the post office and you chat with the guy who's, giving you, making change for you, giving you your letter, and you can talk about something else,
I mean,
interesting, right?
just so I understand,
Yeah.
are you saying that people work because of the threat of taxes? Because certainly if you're unemployed, you're not paying any taxes, at least in the US right now.
Yeah. But when you talk about, I went to school and I could have
Yeah.
had the same job without going to school, where does why was that even be a discussion point? Because
Mhm.
of the whole tax, it stems from the coercive taxation, that whole discussion point. Without coercive taxation, that discussion point doesn't come in. Nobody would think about going to school to make money, to learn something to make money, if it wasn't for coercive taxation.
Do you think money could exist without taxes, coercive? Like, I mean, I
Well,
guess, yeah.
can a tax credit exist without a tax? No.
Well, that's not how I'm defining money in that case. So yes, if you
Well,
put it in a
that,
tautology that it could a tax
well, yeah.
credit exist, but yeah.
Well, yeah. So you'd have to define it some way before you ask me the
Well,
question.
I think
But
of it as at the very least, like expressing, like the convenience. In other words, it's meeting the double coincidence of wants.
what's it though? What's the thing that's meeting? Is it a tax credit or is
Trade,
it?
trade.
No, trade's not a thing. What's the actual token that's meeting
Oh, it could be
the
gold, it
yeah.
could be cowhides, it could
Okay,
be,
okay,
yeah.
so that thing would have intrinsic value. So now you're back to barter. Otherwise, there's no value.
Okay, so this is why it
There's,
seems like
there's no
when
way
you
of
use
valuing it.
when you
So
use
when I
money and
talked about
barter, it's different than how
right, when
other
I use
people, yeah.
yeah, when I talked about value system, one, the value of the monetary system, you say it has no value. Let's go to what I'd call barter, where things have intrinsic value. Or you can go to tax credits where they have value because they're needed to pay tax. And now the monopolist decides the value by what it makes you do to get the thing you need to pay the tax. And so those are two different systems. And that's the one we have right now, where the currency monopolist, I'll call them from issue or whatever you want to call it, the one with the taxing authority is telling you what you have to do to get the tax credit. That's where the value is coming from.
I understand that point, but if I
Yeah.
understood correctly, but it could be the case. In other words, one could say, okay, this thing usually has taken X amount of time, and it seems to be something that is common to groups of people
Well,
trading.
you can go to non-monetary societies and look at
Yeah.
how they operate. You go to American Indians before they were monetized. First of all, they didn't own it much anyway. And how did they exchange things with each other? And you can look at how things were exchanged and how far they got in terms of trade and everything else with the other tribes. Of course, they were entirely fierce. They were
Yeah.
major. It was a big military situation, right? I mean, they're always raiding each other, killing each other. Not to the extent we do, but it was continuous warfare.
Uh-huh.
There's also a gift
And
economy too, though.
there was gifts economy, and there was obligation. Somebody to help you out, so you helped them. When people came to the U.S., started a new town, 50 people would build a guy's house, and then they'd build the next guy's house, and then everybody would help out,
Well, there
and
was
that
world
works.
trade. There was the Silk
And there
Road.
was
There was
there
world
was some world
trade. Yeah.
trade, but it works to an extent, right? But nothing like it works now.
No, no,
Nothing like it works when you're monetized. So,
in
but
other
yes, you
words,
can do it without. You can do it without it, but it doesn't develop the same way.
no, I get that point. I'm not
Yeah,
arguing about whether or not I have to pay taxes on April 15th or before. I'm going to do that no matter what. I don't want to be in jail,
yeah,
of course, absolutely. That my money's going towards that. The reason I guess I
yeah.
asked that
Well,
is
let me just
because
say, look, having that dollar as a tax credit then drives world trade the way it wouldn't be driven if it was just barter of some type.
historically or right now,
Anytime.
it can't be any time.
Well, if you look at trade before without some kind of tax credit currency, it was, I'm sure it was far less than when there was a tax credit type of currency.
That that that's fine. I mean, I'm just
Yeah.
the mere reason I'm asking is because it's
But
like,
do you
yeah, go
need all
ahead.
that trade? Do you need all that trade? Not particularly. I mean, it's nice, it's enriching and everything, but you can certainly live without it.
No, I'm all for trade. I'm a
Yeah,
free
yeah,
trader here. The free
yeah.
trader. Eamon, did you want to say something? I thought you came off mute or not.
I just mentioned the gift economy. That was
Oh, okay.
I'm done with that.
Yeah. And there's a whole literature on that, how that worked. If you accidentally killed somebody from another tribe, what you had to pay them to compensate or give them or do for them. And those
Right.
things became tokens that were traded. So yeah, it's kind of like a tax type of thing. It's a moral obligation rather
There
than,
were there were obligations in communities
yeah,
versus
yeah,
intercommunities. No, I guess again
yeah,
the
yeah.
reason I was just bringing that up is because when I think of again back to my Thomas Jefferson version, the claim that they're making against the state, like the right, they're saying, look, there's a world outside the nation. Yes, we are citizens of this nation, but if I go to another country, if I go to China, if I go to South Africa, if I go to Scandinavia, I'm just choosing places around the world. I'm not a citizen of that country, but I have rights in that country. They might violate
Only,
them.
only if the country honors those rights. Huh?
How
I
can they
mean, you
give
go,
you rights, though?
well, I mean, if you go to some place where drugs are the death penalty and they're not here, it's just had 6 people get killed somewhere because they've got the death penalty
But
for
that's a
drugs, right?
political aspect. In other words, when I'm saying rights, there's the law and there's rights, right?
Well, it's
Meaning
all
you have
political, though, right?
it is a death penalty.
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is political, this rights thing.
No, rights would come from society. That's why I had. This
Well,
is why I went up
is,
to the yeah.
isn't that political?
No, there should be. Do you think there's a distinction between the state and society?
Well, I think there's a distinction, but I think that things flowing from society, it's like a political flow,
Say more. Just yeah.
as opposed to an operational type of flow. There's flow that's done through personally is I tend to consider a political flow. It's a determination by a person as to what should be done or not, rather than a compelling thing like if you don't put gas in the car, it won't go. You've got something like if you can't get somebody to drive you and you don't know how to drive, it's not going to happen. So you got the political aspect and then you have the operational aspect. So maybe I'm being too general with my word political.
Like for example,
I don't mean
the,
necessarily representative.
right. I mean, usually this distinction it's in like the Napoleonic Code that there was a distinction between your citizen rights and your human rights. So in other words, you had a right to
Yeah,
property,
yeah,
but you don't
yeah,
have a
yeah.
right. That's what I mean. Like
But
yes.
those are all the flow of those rights. It's through a political process.
How do you see property as flowing from political rights?
Well, I mean, the flow is that it's property rights enforcement, right? You
Enforcement.
know, yeah. So if you
That's not
think
the
you
right,
have,
though.
well, does a right exist independent of enforcement?
How else could someone say it's violated or not enforced?
Yeah, but if you have the right to something, but there's no enforcement, do you have the right?
I mean, I think so. In other words, one can
I
say
mean,
the
if
ex
Trump is not allowed to invade Canada, but there's no way for us to enforce it, and the army is loyal to him, that you know, I don't, he might not have the right to do that under whatever, but he does it, and
well,
it
think
doesn't
about
make
it
it.
like this.
It's
King,
moot. The whole thing's kind of moot, right?
no, not it doesn't make it moot. This is, King George III didn't enforce the rights of the colonists, and so they overthrew him. That was their kind of justification.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
he contradicted their will. You know, it's like that Monty Python sketch about I have a right to be a woman. I have a right to have babies. The man. Have you seen that?
Yeah. Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So does he have a right to have children? As a man. It's the same kind of question. You
It's
could say
kind of not the same
now,
question because
but politically, you could give him the right to have children, but for all practical purposes, that's kind of moot.
in other words, do you find that the state is just might makes right? It's whoever is conquering.
I think there is that level of understanding. That's not a misread of how things work. Do I think that the S word comes in? It should be. That's a whole different thing. But do I recognize that as the case in many cases? Yes. I recognize might makes right lots of time, all over the place. I see the mother beating up her kids in Kmart. It's might makes right. These kids don't have any rights at that point in time. So, and then if somebody calls child welfare and they come in, well, now they have rights. Now, did they always have rights existentially somehow? Okay, Potentially, yeah, probably, yes. I don't disagree with that. I mean, I understand where all these things come from and what they do, but I personally always add a practical level to what's happening, whether it's just like moot or not, you know?
I think moot is too strong because I don't disagree that the US state is violating our rights or anything like that. Obviously, I don't want them to
Yeah,
violate any of your rights, Warren,
yeah,
at all. But it's just one of these things that on what basis can one even say it? If it's all just moot, then it really just is, you know, I actually think it can't even explain history, it just kind of might makes right, because the second someone becomes weak enough, they could just be overthrown. And then, in a sense, there was nothing ever
yeah,
happened in
yeah,
history. Yeah.
yeah. So it's like one of my other statements that I like, like
Uh-huh.
what if there were no hypotheticals,
That's good. It's like a self-destroying one like that. Anyways,
Yeah, yeah.
we got off, but how about tell us more about how you came up with MMT as well? You were telling us the bank story and then
Oh,
returning.
yeah. So I was at Bankers Trust. I was in sales at the time. So how did I know that in 1977? I don't know. And I'd come up with things like the Fed raised their reserve requirement, and Alan chimes in just a couple months later. Well, I hope they don't just give the banks the money this time, the reserves. Money supply is too high. They should make them reduce the money supply. I say, Alan, you can't do that. There's no such thing. Uh, it's just a debit and a credit on the spreadsheet. If you raise this one side, you can't. You got to add the other side. And he's there. Well, there's 300 billion euro dollars sloshing around. So it's the same thing there. It's just a debit and a credit. He goes, well, I don't know. So anyway, that's when my partner to be, Cliff Viner, who I had known, was at Phoenix Mutual in Hartford, and he calls me because that was in the Wall Street Journal. Eric Heinemann was Morgan Stanley's chief economist, famous guy at the time, kind of like Paul Krugman might be famous today, but he was Morgan Stanley's guy. And he wrote in the Wall Street Journal editorial that he hopes the Fed doesn't just give them the money when they raise reserve requirements like they always do. And maybe that's where Alan got it. I don't know. So I explained it to Cliff and said, it's nonsense and why. And he called Morgan Stanley. And he comes back to me with their answer, which was a bunch of double talk, which I straightened out. And he went back to them and calls me back and he says, Morgan Stanley retracted their position. They agree the Fed has to add the money. So again, I'm 28 years old or something. Like, how did I know that when the chief economist, world famous guy
Mhm.
from Morgan Stanley, just gets it flat out wrong on something that simple? But I think it's that simple. I don't know. So where did this stuff come from? Where did MMT come from? I don't know. But as more of these things came on that I recognized were wrong or backwards, uh, you know, it that body of knowledge continued to expand, and none of it ever got corrected. What I saw as wrong in 1977 about where's the money going to come from is still there.
Yeah.
It's not like it's been a rolling thing where I come up with something, everybody sees it, and I come up with the next thing, everybody sees it. It's just been compounding.
Yeah.
Where today, after how many years is that? 50 years or something, 45 years. I can go through, 10 different things. We had the seven deadly innocent frauds, things they have completely backwards. They've had backwards all along, and they're undermining our standard of living, you
Yeah.
know, and they're like trying to kill the geese that are laying the golden eggs over and over again. And the other side's fighting back from it is just as ridiculous of a position.
I
I mean,
mean,
it's the same society that builds a cell phone. You know how hard that is?
oh yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
How can they get the money backwards? How can they get trade backwards? How can they get, spending backwards? How can they do all this stuff? How can they get the interest rate thing backwards? There's a whole Federal Reserve with 200 PhDs. I don't know how many billion in research. Don't any of them know this?
Is it
Yeah.
possible that it's in their interest to get it backwards?
I
Or
you know, I used to think so and try and discover that, and I've never been able to. The ones I've met, it's just like, oh no,
Yeah,
it's it's like,
I personally, even though I guess I'm supposed to represent the Marxists, I'm usually very skeptical of in the interest, like if as if it's a
yeah,
conspiracy. I think people can think wrong. I don't think they're like, how do we, confuse the plebes or something like that. But
yeah,
one question I wanted to ask is that in the account that I'm going to have to put it as MMT. I know there's different
Yeah.
people and people have different accounts, but it seems like it's something that truly becomes at least conceptually possible post Bretton Woods
All
because
right. So look,
yeah,
so here's the thing. It's a framework for analysis. It's not
yeah.
about anything being conceptually possible. So what MMT has is what I have and how I started the whole thing. I like to call it the base case for purposes of analysis. So I build a model, a simple model, which I call the base case. So I start with a model. I start with a tax liability. I start with that tax liability causes unemployment and excess capacity, things for sale. It causes sellers of goods and services that we happen to define as unemployed. They come to work for the government, they get paid, and they pay the tax. Now, what if they come and work and earn more than they need to pay the tax? In my base case for analysis, they might come and work. The government offers a job to anyone who wants one. They show up for work, they earn the money, they pay the tax. And if there's any left over, they've got leftover money, leftover tax credits, leftover US dollars for whatever reason. They miscalculated, they want to save in case for a rainy day, they want to keep them as souvenirs. It doesn't matter. Okay, so in this base case for analysis, I have to at least, I will at least spend enough to cover the need to pay taxes. Otherwise, the taxes don't get paid. Somebody
Yep.
gets their house burned down. Okay. I'll also most likely, well, I will cover any desires to save. Now, how do you define desires to save? People willing to work to get those extra dollars. So I cover those. Okay. I'm not paying any interest on those dollars. So my base case for analysis is a zero rate policy. Does that mean MMT advocates a zero rate policy? No. It means in my base case, that's what I have. And you can start an economy, which I did, three of them, those buckaroos and the other school currencies, with the base case for analysis. And nobody gets interest on their savings. Now, if you want to, Japan for 30 years did exactly that. Nobody got interest on their savings.
Mhm.
You can look at it and say, it was horrible. They should have paid interest. Fine. Or you can look at it and say, oh, it was wonderful. No inflation, no unemployment. And they didn't pay any interest. Let's leave it alone. This base case for analysis is okay. So it's a base case for analysis. I put the burden of proof on somebody who wants to change my base case. So if you think a positive interest rate is good, the burden of proof is on you. I'll present the base case. My base case is I offer a job to anyone who wants full employment by definition. Okay, and the UMKC Buckaroo does the same thing, and our other currencies do. And it's never caused any kind of problem with anything. It never caused inflation or anything else, which I can get into later. But if you decide you want to limit how government's going to spend their money based on how many people subsequently pay their tax, which is kind of
Yeah.
weird. But if you want to do that, you're willing to try it out. But the burden of proof is on you that that's going to be better than my base case, which is that anybody who wants a job has one. Is that MMT trying to impose a full employment at JG? No, I'm just making a statement. My base case, I've got a JG. If you ask me to set up a new currency in Gaza, that's how I do it. If you want to argue that that's the idea, you're better off causing unemployment, go ahead and argue it. And we'll see who prevails. But meanwhile, my base case starts with this. So they're not proposals of what to do in your country. They are my base case for setting up a currency.
But
And
told you,
that's where MMT
yeah.
proponents go awry. They start presenting this as, well, MMT means everybody gets a job.
Right. No,
Go ahead.
no, I understand. The reason I'm being annoying about this, I'm sorry. I'm
Yeah,
sorry if
yeah.
I'm annoying Warren about
No,
this.
it's good. It's good because I hear this all the time. Yeah.
The reason I keep bringing this up is that number one, we were saying earlier that in your base case, when say the U.S. was under a gold standard, it doesn't quite work, right? Because
Well, we
there's
know
this
the
other
gold
thing.
standard didn't. We know the gold standard didn't work, or we wouldn't have got
Right.
off it.
Okay. No,
That,
do you see my point I'm saying is that like your base case
my,
is then beginning afterwards.
no. My base case is exactly what I said. Now, if you want to say, "Oh, I got an idea," let's have the government buy and sell gold at a fixed price so that we can fix the value of the money to gold. I'd say, good luck, because I can give you a lot of reasons not to do it, but you're willing to try it, which the US did and everybody else did, and it utterly collapsed. And now we're back closer to the base case than we were when we were on a gold standard. So the gold standard is not a base case.
I didn't say
That's
the
a
gold standard was the base case. I
it's a
said that,
derivative. It's a derivative. Yeah,
yeah. But,
and it
and I guess the only argument I'm making is I'm trying to say when was it, maybe it was plausible, the gold standard for, I mean, in other words, it existed for quite some time that people really did
yeah
trade on this. And I guess
yeah.
the easy answer is they're a bunch of silly, stupid people in the end. I don't know why we did this like thing for several centuries and now,
Why have we been doing our budgeting and having 5 and 10% unemployment, in terms of
yeah.
real unemployment, and giving up more real wealth than we've lost in every war combined in the history of the world? Why are we doing that? Because we don't understand the monetary system. We don't understand the base case for analysis. We don't understand that it
But
actually functions that way.
But apparently, it might have been more right when we were on the gold standard. I'm not saying the gold
Well,
standard
you
was
could
good.
say
I'm
that,
just
but
saying, yeah.
you'd have to prove that to me. I'm not going to try and
Oh,
prove
I
that.
thought you already proved that to me when you said that the Austrians are right in terms of the gold standard
No, their
analysis.
analysis is correct.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you do it.
And
It means you
I'm
have.
not saying should. I'm not, there's no should here. There's no
Yeah, if you show me a
should.
country with a you show me a country with a gold standard or fixed exchange rate, I'll say, oh, there's a natural rate of interest that's determined by savings and investment in that society, just like the Austrians say. If you say you're on a floating exchange rate, I say, okay, there's no natural rate of interest. That's fixed exchange rate thing. With a floating exchange rate, if you want to have a natural interest discussion, you're talking about a zero rate policy. That would be the natural interest rate of interest. So, yeah,
So, Warren, are you suggesting that, say, 150, 200 years ago, the United States or the United States or Britain could have been on a floating exchange system uh, and your base case could have applied?
without a doubt. And they can go
Okay.
back on it tomorrow. And any country in the world can go back on it tomorrow, be at full employment, add enormously to their real wealth and not have any of the negative consequences they presume will happen.
Right. So in a sense,
And if
history has been waiting to consummate until 1971, where we,
uh,
I don't
yeah,
know.
if
Yeah.
you could say that, but it was a self-imposed thing because even then
Because
the Fed was doing its own version of fractional reserves,
because you
floating
kind of
exchange rate.
you sort of mentioned earlier that like there were payments in kind at one time and that we have a monetary system, meaning most of human civilization was not based on people working for a wage, right?
No, but
Like
if you look at the medieval times, there was an enormous amount of floating exchange rate. Alfred the Great's whole thing was floating exchange rates,
yeah,
and he
but there
had
was also an
coins.
enormous amount of not working on money at all, like most,
Yeah,
meaning
maybe,
once
but
you have to think
but
about
only,
this.
but only when you got outside of the capital where there wasn't any tax enforcement. When you
Right,
had
which was
areas
the
of,
massive people. In other words, what
oh
was
yeah,
happening in the cities were the burgers. There was yeah,
yeah,
of
yeah,
course this makes sense. But the reason I bring this up is that, of course, you mentioned Rome earlier. Rome did try to
yeah.
introduce payment and taxes in terms of money at least twice that fell through. Same with Louis the 14th, because they
Mhm.
were trying to tax people who, in a sense, didn't live by money. They lived, mainly by
Excuse me
agriculture.
once.
Go ahead.
Excuse me
Yeah,
one
go ahead.
second. Yeah, go ahead.
The authority? And it's just the
Yeah,
authorities are here.
look,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sure lots of people have attempted things that have failed, but for different reasons. But we have the system in place. We're just
I,
opposed.
I,
Yeah,
I feel like what I'm trying to say is that I'm not disagreeing that this has been the case. I'm trying to say, how did
yeah.
this come about? Meaning it's one
Oh,
thing,
yeah.
yeah.
I'll leave that. I'll leave that to you.
Well, the reason I bring this up is because it, how it came about might actually explain a lot about what is, and not just simply you can
Yeah.
start with what is. But I
No,
just thought, yeah.
I'm listening.
Well, okay, like in the example that you give, I mean, when you say
Yeah.
taxation, if you were to just tax people and say you're going to give me Warren bucks, and they're like, okay, I'm a peasant who just works on like agriculture and I never trade, then you're causing an enormous change in society as opposed to if you're taxing people today who live by that, who
Yes,
everything they do. And so what I'm
that's right.
trying to say is that change in history was not slightly different. Like we're not slightly different than ancient Sumeria. It was qualitatively different. And that's
Okay.
actually back to the American Revolution. I haven't even mentioned Marx at all. I'm like pure patriotic American Revolution
Yeah. Yeah.
today.
I'm waiting for Marx. So I was
We might
hoping to
not
learn
even get
something.
to it. We might not
I
even
was,
get to it. I'm
I was
just going to
hoping to
do
learn
concepts.
something.
Yeah.
I came to learn something about Marx.
Well, yeah, it's a more difficult thing, I guess, there, but it's like I'm just trying to say that, the 18th century recognized that, okay, people are living very different than they did in the past, and actually it's
Yeah,
allowing us to even tax people in terms of money in a way that had failed numerous times.
true,
And
true.
so I guess the reason I bring that up is that, again, it seems like, okay, the modern monetary system actually does presuppose something about society, about how people live in order to even function in any real way. That you have a
Yeah,
monetary economy.
yeah, it's a conditional situation
Yeah.
where not that you have a monetary economy, but if you have taxing authority and you can make it work,
Well, you could
then this
create a
is
gigantic disaster if you just tax. Again, we have examples from Rome and France where they just tried to introduce money and it just led to a disaster and they had to go back to payments in kind.
yeah, I don't know the details of what happened. So,
Okay. Anyways, keep going.
but
I'm also,
usually
yeah.
every time I've gotten to the details of those things, it's because their collection process failed. They didn't have it. They didn't have enforceability.
Well,
At some level.
doesn't that actually go into the enforcement processes? It has to be the case that people can even live in some way to be able to pay these taxes.
Sure. Otherwise, you
Yeah.
get a revolution. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, I'm also enjoying your story. Like, I know I'm supposed to
Okay.
play this other role, but I'm like also having fun listening to these stories.
Okay.
Yeah. So keep going with this so then 70s, it's going into the 80s. Do you start to
Oh, yeah.
conceptualize things? How is this happening?
Yeah. So, it's interesting. I started a fund in 1982. It was fairly small, $10 million of investor money, and ran it for 15 years.
Fixed income or any third multi?
Fixed income,
Yeah.
market neutral, which means we didn't care if the interest rates went up or down. We didn't take credit risk. It was
Hmm.
mostly what you call conversion trades. It involved all kinds of derivatives and things like that. And we didn't have, that I can recall, a losing trade in 15 years. But nobody ever liked my trade ideas, my arbitrage ideas. So, after 14 years of all winning trades, and our alpha was like we make an extra 6% over the risk-free rate, which was, good for,
Oh, yeah.
was
Over the
was
risk-free
steady.
rate. Yeah.
Yeah. So if the Fed funds rate averaged 8 during that period of time, we made 14.
Were you benching to like the ag or anything, or was it
Yeah,
just,
Fed
yeah.
funds.
Oh, the Fed funds. I didn't, not like a
Yeah.
Barclays, like, I don't
No,
know.
no,
Okay. Yeah.
no. We were indexed to Fed funds. It was a pure alpha type thing. And I don't even know if they called it alpha back then. And so we got investors who just wanted to earn an incremental return over the bank, so to speak. They had money for that. It might be 1% or 2% of their assets in the region. And so I'd like be long cash and short futures because I thought the cash was at a discount to the future, long bonds and short bond futures or something like that. But it would also involve the delivery process and things like that that gave me insight into what I thought the valuations were that I could realize would be, what the realized valuation. And so after 14 years, I'd say, we can do this and that with rates and caps and options and whatever. And everybody would go, no, that's not going to work. It's like you'd think that after 14 years of every trade working, they might say, man, it really, I like this. I know it's going to work, but could you explain it to me? No, they said, no, it's never going to work.
You didn't have competitor funds start to, like, I know if you look at the
No,
Morningstar data, you can see the
no,
alpha
no.
kind of,
Well,
yeah.
whatever were our supposed competitors, we always were way ahead of them.
Yeah.
And one of our clients was Harvard Management, and they were doing the same thing because I liked it. And they would take our positions and put them on their own books and pay us a commission for executing the trades for them. And they would cherry pick all my positions, which were in the fund. And at the end of the year, our fund, after subtracting 20% fees or whatever, would report our return for the money. Let's say if they had $50 million in the fund and it was a 10% return. So they'd get $5 million return. They had $55 million. And then they'd look at their returns they made on their own investments, the one they cherry picked. And it was always less than 10%.
Ah,
So they were never even able to like pick our best trade successfully.
You didn't want to just like put him out of business, like you just dip the expense ratio and just kind of knock
well,
him out
well,
of, yeah.
well, they weren't in the same business. They had this is
Okay.
the endowment. They had about 15
Oh, I
billion in
see.
the
Yeah.
endowment at the time, 1 or 2 billion in fixed income. And the managers there, it was the head guy was Dave Middleman, who was a friend of mine, and he died a few years ago with brain cancer, some horrible thing.
Oof.
But yeah, but anyway, he was very good, and so he'd laugh and he said, as soon as I can do better than you're doing with my money, I'm going to pull my money out of your fund, and just do all the trades, because he wanted to. It's just a friendly rivalry where he's trying to beat his own investment, right?
Yeah.
And he never did.
Do you think it was,
Well,
I'm going back to something you said
yeah,
earlier, is it even something that could have been beatable? I know you've said that a lot of the financial system
yeah,
it's just like overhead by now. Here, I'll use a Marx phrase since I haven't
yeah.
used
Well,
Marx yet. Ready?
this was without overhead.
No,
His
no, no, no,
returns had
no, no,
made
no.
no.
I mean that you said that a lot of it, what I understood earlier that you were saying is that a lot of the financial system is kind of dead weight and we could do without is
Oh
what
yeah, we didn't need
yeah.
this. This served no further purpose for it.
There's a
It was a
great
complete waste of human endeavor.
here's the one Marx thing I'll say today. He has a French for faux phrase, which is overhead. So that's why I was kind of using that.
Yeah,
There's a lot of like overhead. But what do you gave a kind of vision if maybe you could talk about how the entire financial system could just be turned into like one thing? I didn't quite understand that. And I was wondering if that was related to your Peter Lynch-like success, it sounds like, with getting alpha for, 15 years
I, I
compounded. Yeah.
I guess I don't understand the question.
Oh, what is your vision for the like financial system? And I was wondering if
Oh,
that
so
was
we know.
related to
Yeah,
working in it. Yeah.
it would be in today's terms, it would be gutted. It would be about 5% of what it is right now. There'd be no stock trading. So all these teachers' retirement funds that have these tens of thousands of highly paid equity guys would just not have jobs.
So we should do
Okay.
Doge
Yeah.
to the financial industry.
Right, right. I can cut that 2 trillion in spending in no time. Go to zero rates. It's 1.2 trillion per year. Okay, longer term, not the first year, but longer term. So they'd probably score it as $20 trillion cut, and then eliminating all the excess stuff in the financial system. All the stock trading and the bond traders and all these people. It'd be at least that much a year, and then the list is long about how you just get rid of these things that have like
But you had this
no
idea
real
of
value. They're
you
all
had this
people
I
digging holes and filling them in.
so I guess the reason I was trying to link it to
Oh,
your
look, if we go to
yeah,
Medicare for all, we save, $500 billion a year in total waste of human
right.
endeavor. Five million people are out of work looking for jobs. When unemployment goes up by 5 million, do you raise taxes? No, right? Okay, that's called a recession. So if we go to Medicare for all, and there's 5 million former people in advertising and marketing and healthcare those types out of work, and now we need an economy with enough demand to reabsorb them. You don't raise taxes. But Bernie Sanders says we have to raise taxes $2 trillion to have Medicare for all. And Hillary Clinton says, see, we can't afford that. We have to have Obamacare. And so it's a disaster. And the headline left is the reason we don't have it, because they don't understand monetary operations and what they're doing.
Hmm.
They're just horrible. Okay.
I mean,
And
but
and
nonetheless, like yeah.
the right's even worse. I mean, I'm just trying to get the it's all bad. It's all thoroughly bad in terms of outcomes.
Yeah. The first thing I was trying to ask was you said something about unlimited shares. I was trying to understand
Oh
that. I
yeah,
was
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So if you have a company that comes to the public at $10 a share, so many shares, but they're required to offer unlimited shares at $20 a share. Nobody will ever buy those shares, right? Unless the stock price moves such that it goes over 20, it'll never go over 20. Because once it gets to 20, who would pay 21 when you can buy all the stock you want from the company at 20? That money would go to the company who would be doing investment. Presumably, people would be buying it because there's a high return on that investment. It would give them a good dividend, it's compounded or whatever, compounded real value of that company, and so it wouldn't affect or hurt the company or anything. But there'd be no more stock trading. Anybody who wants a larger investment in that company would just buy more stock at $20 a share from that company, and they'd buy it because there's good value at that price in terms of what the company's returns are, profitability. And so it eliminates 95% of all stock market, which includes the traders, all the technical analysts, and all that nonsense. And all you have is fundamental analysts who decide they make their investment decisions based on whether I'm going to get a 6% or an 8% or a 10% real return from these shares if I own them, not whether I can find somebody to buy them from me at a higher.
So I
Okay.
get that that would stop speculative act. I mean, I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah. In other words,
Yeah.
it's still a big deal, like, trying to decide if you're going to invest in Linden Basil or Nvidia or something like that. I mean, I understand the
Sure.
overhead
Sure.
of, yeah.
But the decision would be a very different decision, and
Hmm.
and banks would still be able to make that decision, right? Or not commercial banks, shadow bank types. But yeah, you'd have investment funds that would make those decisions. But with the activity drying up, that's where most of the GDP is coming from. Most of the extreme wealth is coming from. It's coming from the speculative activity around the market activity around the stock market, not from the just investing. If you look at the private equity market where somebody just invests privately in things, you don't get anywhere near the number of people involved
You would be able to
wasting
buy
their
and
time.
sell. You'd be able to buy and sell in the same day. I know if someone is,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Well,
but the
can't you
bid
still
would
have
all
all sorts of crazy volatility of people buying and selling between different?
now. Well, if the stock is worth 20 on an earnings basis, it's not going to go up over that. You're not going to. It goes to 19 and a half or something. You'd buy it at 19 and a half because you think you're going to get a good return of dividends, not because you think it's going to go to 21. If you think it's going to go up, you think it's going to go up half a point. Right now, people are buying and selling stocks because they're going to double in value and triple in value. They can sell next week. It's not going to happen. It'd be more like the housing market.
Yeah.
How much of that kind of activity do you get in the housing market? Well, you get a fair amount of real estate speculation, but nothing like you get in the stock market or any of the
It
financial
would
market
kill all the growth
derivatives.
strategies. Everything would be dividend.
You'd still
Yeah.
invest for that because it would compound and you get your money in 10 years. Fine. That's what's supposed to be. That's the whole market theory that you learn in school.
That's
That's
all
what
the
drives
dividend
capitalism.
discounting model. You would
Right.
make it
That
the
all,
dividend, yeah.
yeah, and that's what drives capitalism in theory anyway, not
Hmm.
the speculation. Speculation is what takes it down.
Can I be a Marxist that defends speculation just for fun?
Well, let me ask you a question. What does the Marxists think about the lottery?
I don't think there's any specific view on the lottery. Yeah.
I mean, you think it's right that somebody can become a billionaire because everybody buys something for a
I,
dollar?
so the whole myth is that Marxism has any condemnation about inequality. That's why I brought up the tax part earlier. Like, in other words, Marx
Yeah.
thought that was just a silly thing
Yeah, but
that, yeah.
is it exploitation to have people making
No,
each other billionaires? No.
no,
Okay.
I don't. Yeah,
Just
and the
wondering.
the exploitation that this is why I've tried to avoid the Marx point is it's a more
Yeah.
difficult category. It's not a really moral one in
Yeah,
that
that's why I'm
sense.
here.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm here to learn about that. But I know the
So
people like the Bernie Sanders types, they're all trying to tax the rich on the equality basis. Are they against the lottery? So you're not
Vegas a few
against
years ago. I have
billionaires
no
if they're
problem
created
with
by the
doing that.
lottery.
I don't have any
You don't
specific
think they're
issue with
have too
billionaires, to
much
be honest.
influence in the political economy or anything?
No, I think that the state already begets that kind of influence
Gotcha.
as it
Okay.
is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why when I went back to the IRS thing, it's like even if
See, I
you
think we
were,
can
yeah.
eliminate at source the categories by not having lotteries, by not having financial markets that are like lotteries in that sense. Take a lot of small money from a lot of people and give it to a few people because of institutional structure, not because there's anything beneficial going on. There's nothing
Yeah.
beneficial in the process.
Coming back to the question of society, I'm most concerned about freedom. And I just am very
Yeah.
skeptical of the state stepping in to regulate things in
So
ways.
what about the football game where if you stand up, you can see better, but then nobody can see? Should you have your freedom to stand up, or should you be regulation where you can only stand up for 15 seconds?
I mean,
Do you believe?
I guess the question is always, well, number one, the football game is you're agreeing to the private property. You've come in. Nobody's forced you inside the football game.
Right.
Right? In other words, if these are the
Right.
rules of the football stadium and you
Yes.
voluntarily agree to it, then if you stand up, I've been to sports games as a kid and I did stupid things and was warned by the people, like, look, you voluntarily came in here, kind of
Yeah.
thing like that. It's not like they were going to chop my head off or something like that. But where was I going with this? I don't have any personal issue really with inequality. I think it is a kind of wrong target in that
Mm.
sense, going to
Well, the
this.
problem is it's created by institutional structure. It's created by politicians making laws. They create the inequality. And
Can you say more? Follow on that. Yeah.
yeah, well, if they decided to have zero rate policy and just 3-month bills, there'd be no treasury securities. There'd be no firms making tens of billions of dollars a year off government securities. And so you wouldn't have that distribution of income from that source. It's there only because the government's created this stupid game and pays people billions of dollars to play.
And certainly you
There's
could
no
have
reason.
inequality without that. I can
Yes,
understand that.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
But you're adding to it. Okay, you're adding
Yeah.
to it with a national lottery. You're adding to inequality. So you've got institutional structure that's causing these things everywhere. All the laws are pushing that through. Places that don't have our institutional structure don't have the inequality.
I can understand the treasury bill thing. In other words, compounding, you get the
Yeah, or
geometric
the stock market screen. The government gives companies, limited liability. It's a huge gift.
Yeah.
With that comes responsibility as to what it causes. And it causes these huge concentrations
Tax
of
loss
wealth.
harvesting. There you go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Warren. Thanks so much for giving us
Sure.
your time. It's been great and very interesting and
Yeah.
illuminating.
Okay. Thank you.